You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making. Welcome to the Decisive Podcast, brought to you by S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. In this episode, we're discussing the Trump administration's tariffs. So far, there's been a lot of attention placed on the country-to-country tariffs and negotiations, but there's also a wide range of industry reviews which could be just as consequential. With me to discuss these industry reviews are Chris Rogers, head of supply chain research, and John Anton, the lead steel expert in our pricing and purchasing team of economists. It's a real pleasure to have you both on the Decisive today.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you to all the audience for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. It's great to be here again.
So one note that I want to make for our listeners is that we are recording this on May 27th. By the time this airs, some things may have shifted and changed, as they do, but we do still expect to have a high degree of freshness to this conversation. So, Chris, how about you kick us off with a high-level overview of what's going on in terms of the different types of tariff reviews? Are they different for the countries and industries being targeted?
They are indeed. And yeah, it's always good to have the data when we're talking. You know, we're talking just after a weekend where there was momentarily just going to be tariffs on iPhones, and then it was all phones, and there was going to be higher tariffs on Europe, and then there wasn't. So it is important to keep that kind of longer term outlook. In terms of what we're seeing at the moment and what's coming up in the next few months in terms of tariff decisions, there are two broad buckets. One, the country level tariffs. These have been deployed by the administration under the International and Economic Emergency Powers Act. There's a whole bunch of negotiations going on with different countries. Some of that will involve products. So the deal that was reached with the UK included side deals on steel and on autos. So there is a product element there. But the bigger area are these Section 232 reviews of a whole bunch of different industries. A Section 232 review, just to be very basic, is asking the question, does imports to the US lead to a national security challenge? They've been used repeatedly, and we can get into some of the nuts and bolts of that, but those are ongoing. They have a specific structure. They follow a certain time frame. However, there is the flexibility to deploy tariffs quite quickly by the Commerce Department making recommendations to the president. So there's a lot cooking at the moment on tariffs. And I think a lot of the focus, because I guess it's geopolitically interesting, has been on the country tariffs. We just want people to be thinking more about these product tariffs as well.
So which products and sectors are affected by Section 232 tariffs, Chris?
Well, it's a long old list. So we've had 3 reviews that have already been completed. That's steel, aluminium, or as you like to call it, aluminum, and the automotive sector, so passenger vehicles and parts. Those have been completed already. Tariffs have been applied. There's reviews going on for a whole bunch of other industries. Pharmaceutical sector, very broadly. Electronics, that includes not just semiconductors and chip making equipment. It includes computers and smartphones and a whole bunch of other product areas as well. We've also seen reviews on aerospace, copper, critical minerals, forestry, and commercial trucks. So auto parts aren't kind of completely out of the woods yet. So there's a lot of reviews going on. Altogether, those represent about 40% of US imports. So, whilst it feels like some of these individual areas are quite niche, in aggregate, they're quite important.
Yeah, 40%. That's a big figure there. So, Chris, with the inclusion of free trade partners like Canada and South Korea in the National Security Review, how might existing trade agreements be affected?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that so far the trade deals that were reached, so the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the Korea-US agreement or KURUS, they don't appear to have been a block to the president applying tariffs either at the IEEPA level, the country level, or at the individual country level. Exemptions can be granted under Section 232. Really, you can do what you want. You could apply a tariff to a single country, single product, single company even, in theory. But the free trade agreements haven't really acted as kind of any block to that. And one of the reasons is the free trade agreements typically include a clause, and USMCA does and KURUS does, that allows for deviations from tariff-free trade if there is a national security issue. Both USMCA and Corus were renegotiated under the first Trump administration. So, buried deep in the bowels of the legal text includes the ability to carry these kind of areas out. However, you would hope that your free trade partners are also your allies and therefore are not necessarily captured in the same way by the national security issues. But as we've seen with the existing reviews of steel, aluminum and autos, it's not just about the national security in the cold, hard sense of supplying the military with the equipment that they need.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Chris. Reframing what national security looks like.
If I may very briefly, when the first things that came online for Section 232, they originally imposed, the review was in 2017, and they were imposed in 2018, and it was rather surprising to many people. It is based on national security, and yet NATO allies were in no way spared. Now, so even though they are military allies, they had Section 232 tariffs imposed on national security grounds. So that is something to keep in mind, that while they could have been, and some of them later on got some preferential treatment, initially it did not make any difference in the application as was applied, whether they were military allies or not.
And I think if any of our listeners want to go for extra nerd points, and the fact they're listening probably means that they are, there was another route that the president could use, and that's Section 201. Section 201 is basically a safeguarding review. So that's to say, this is an industry that is important to America, doesn't need to be national security. It could be a big employer. It could be whatever. We need to protect it from all comers. And that was used by President Trump in his first administration for washing machines, for solar panels. So it's not clear why 232 needed to be used this time around, other than the fact it also brings a national security kind of halo to the whole thing. But Section 201 could be used. And if legal challenges do come to pass on these reviews, we could see that alternative measure, that Section 201 used as well.
Now, these reviews cut across multiple sectors, including electronics and pharmaceuticals. So that suggests potential supply chain vulnerabilities. Which industries do you think face the most immediate risk of supply chain disruption, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at all of the different products that are being covered by it, none of them are necessarily under immediate threat of disruption and therefore need tariff protection straight away. If you take kind of a midterm review, some of them do. So would you rather be making all of your critical medicines in the country rather than having to ship them from overseas, hedging against the risk that you can't import for some reason? I take tablets for an ongoing condition. I would much rather they were made nearer to where I live rather than being made a long way away. So I get that. But funnily enough, a lot of the pharmaceuticals that cross borders are actually the more kind of health management products like GLP-1 inhibitors rather than critical medicines per se. I think the one where there is the most validity to think about supply chain disruption is electronics, and specifically mature node semiconductors. So these are chips that are used in everyday devices. This isn't AI and all of the newer stuff. And that's an area where we're seeing some countries, including mainland China, try and build out their capabilities. So on a 5-year view, there could be issues with securing the import of those products. The issue then comes, is applying these tariffs going to be counterproductive? So are you actually going to see, by putting tariffs in place, an interruption to supply chains? And I think a lot of the volatility we've seen in trade data over the past month or so has shown how disruptive tariffs can be and the uncertainty of tariffs can be. The good news is we've got a long time series in terms of these steel and aluminum tariffs that were applied during the first Trump administration and updated earlier this year that will show how these tariffs can kind of have an impact on the industry from a longer term perspective. But that's for John to talk about.
Yes, John, as we've been discussing, there are a lot of moving parts here, a lot of uncertainty. Let's talk about metals in particular, steel and aluminum, or aluminium, depending on where our listeners are sitting. In President Trump's first term, as you mentioned, we did see tariffs on steel and aluminum, but we also had exclusions and exemptions. Can you first tell us quickly the difference between exclusions and exemptions?
Yes. So first, the reason for suing Section 232, there's been a lot of trade actions historically targeting one country at a time. And all that would happen is, or at least the story was, okay, if you hit country A in Asia, people will just move production to country B and get around it. So by hitting every country in the world at the same time under Section 232, basically you prevented whack-a-mole and you got everybody so no one could escape. And so Section 232 was universally applied to every country in the world. Then it was walked back a little bit, and exemptions apply to countries. So a country could be exempt. The initial exemptions were applied to Argentina, Brazil, and South Korea. They could only send 70% of prior tonnage, but they faced zero tariff rate. And then more exemptions were applied to more countries as time went by. An exclusion is product specific. If you cannot make the product in the U.S. or you cannot make it in sufficient quantity, let's say there's no capacity for making steel for razor blades in the U.S., then there was no reason to have a tariff on it. It hurt buyers in the U.S. without helping any U.S. steel company. So that would be an exclusion, and you had to apply for them. Nothing was initially excluded. People had to apply product by product by product to get an exclusion, and sometimes granted, sometimes not. So a little bit of a technical term between the two, but they actually do have a little bit different meaning, and they certainly had a different process to try to get to the same endpoint, which was no tariff.
Yes, important distinctions there. So thanks for that. Now, we did have exclusions and exemptions in President Trump's first term. How about now? Where are we seeing exclusions and exemptions in the second term?
Nowhere on no thing. That is a hallmark of what has happened. The exemptions by country, I mean, by the end, you had over 70% of the steel coming in was not covered. The big two are over 40% of U.S. imports come from Canada or Mexico. And when you took out Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, South Korea, the European Union, Japan, United Kingdom, and to some extent India, you had whittled down the coverage tremendously. So exemptions became widespread. That was first under President Trump, then under President Biden. The hallmark this time is sweeping the table clean, no exemptions, no exclusions. If you're buying steel or you're buying aluminum, right now you will be paying a 25% tariff, and that's basically the end of the story, which is a pretty significant change.
That is definitely significant. And are there any other differences between Trump's first term and his second term worth highlighting here, John?
Yes, the major difference would be on aluminum. The initial tariff rate under Section 232, again, studied in 2017, imposed in March 2018, was 25% on steel, and that was only on steel, and 10% on aluminum. But what was not covered, and now aluminum is 25%. So the rate on aluminum has doubled in a half. 10 to 25 is a big difference in rates. The second change is, okay, people wouldn't buy steel and import it into the U.S. People would buy parts and fabrications made out of steel and import them into the U.S. And so go with Chris on nerd speak, Harmonized Code 72 is steel. And pretty much everything was covered except for the raw materials, iron ore and scrap. Everything else was covered essentially. But 73, which is fabrications, trusses, boilers, bearings, nails and screws, generally were not covered. Now it's not universal. You really have to check your code, but almost everything in fabricated metals, Harmonized Code 73, is also covered. So the President Trump in his proclamation basically said, I did the right thing before, but it failed because there were loopholes. He wanted to close the loopholes. And the biggest ones were no exemptions by country and by covering fabrications, not just steel, but things made of steel, not just aluminum, but things made of aluminum. And it really did change the coverage quite a bit.
Yeah, that does sound like another big difference between first term and second term there. So thanks for walking us through that, John. Now, given the recent removal of exemptions from Section 232 duties on steel and aluminum, how do you foresee this affecting the pricing of these metals, both in the short term and in the long term?
I'm more the steel expert, so I'm going to go with that, but I can allude also to aluminum. But steel prices jumped tremendously right after the announcements were made in early January. Prices that were approximately, well, actually a fair price probably would have been just over $700 a ton, but there was a market law. That's a short ton, 2,000 pounds, not a metric ton. So for the U.S. audience, it was about prices were around 700. For international audiences in metric tons, prices were around 770. It's about 10%. Prices jumped to approximately $1,000 a ton. So they went up by approximately 50% within a matter of a month or less. But they're starting to come back down. That was too much. And for the mid and long term, by the end of this year and going forward, for as long as the tariffs are in place, we see prices approximately 10 to 12% higher than they otherwise would have been. So if you took our end of 2024 forecast and compared it to our forecast now, prices are about 10 to 12% higher. And one thing to note about Section 232, it does not expire ever. It takes a president to go in, whether it be President Trump in the next 3.5 years or a successor in 2028 or 2035. These tariffs will stay in place until a president lifts them. We have no idea when that will be. That's a political decision. But for as long as they're in place, we see prices about 10 to 12% higher than they otherwise would have been, which is pretty significant.
Can you elaborate on how the tariffs on steel and aluminum might influence downstream industries? I'm particularly thinking of construction and manufacturing, but...
Very strongly, because again, if you're making something in the U.S. and steel or metals are approximately, for many things, it's approximately 30% of your input costs. There are things where it's much, much higher, but for machinery and finished goods along that line, it can be 20 to 30% of your input cost. And if you just add 10% to it, so you added 3% overall to your cost of making that good. And if you're competing with an international company that they're selling the same product, that same piece of machinery that's not paying these tariffs, it puts you at more of a disadvantage. Either you have a narrower profit margin, or you're running a loss, or you raise prices and you risk falling sales. So initially, companies may eat it, but eventually, the longer it's in place, the more it'll be passed on to consumers.
So since this is the decisive, we like to talk about decisions and decision-making. Chris, can you remind our listeners when various decisions are expected, at least as of May 27th, when we are recording this? And what are the next shoes we expect to drop in terms of tariffs?
Yes, so I think when it comes to shoes specifically, that's going to be potentially July 9th. So the country level tariffs, these negotiations that are ongoing, President Trump has set a deadline of July 9th for the negotiations with different countries. But as we've seen very recently, if he's not seeing the movement he wants from particular countries or regions to negotiate with him, then further threats could be made in the meantime. The exception to that is China. China's 90-day pause was introduced latterly, so we've got until around August the 12th for implementation from August 14th for that. On the product side, on the Section 232 side, this is where it gets complicated because it's all been really easy so far. There's two effective dates. One is when the review is launched, there's then a consultation period that lasts for around a month. For most of the 232s that have been launched, that period is either ending or has ended already. In aggregate, the Commerce Department has 270 days to make a decision, to make a recommendation, but that is a deadline. That's not like when they make the announcement. Historically, they've waited till the last minute because you want to give the president as much flexibility as possible, but it could make recommendations as soon as the consultations are done. So in theory, we could have Section 232 tariffs announced in a series of waves in June, July and August. The deadlines, though, are around the December and January period. So we've got this period really from now through the end of the year when the Section 232s could land more or less whenever.
John, what about copper? I know that's, outside of your core focus on steel, but what are our expectations around that?
I focus on steel, but I keep up with all the metals, and copper is a big one. And first, very notable, the big three metals are steel, copper, and aluminum. All the others have their varying importance, but those are the big three. Steel and aluminum were hit in 2018. Copper was not hit. Introducing the review on copper now in 2025 is a big change, and it is under review for Section 232. It's an expedited review process, as Chris went through, that things could be happening soon. Within our forecast, we have to basically say, when do we think this will happen? We are assuming probably late Q3 or in Q4 it will be imposed, but markets are already pricing it in. U.S. markets are already pricing in at least a 10% tariff, and U.S. prices are already higher than global prices by that amount, even though it has not been imposed yet. And so we are looking, the market is assuming 10%, which is what we are also assuming. There is a significant risk, although the odds are far less than 50%, we believe, but there is a significant risk that steel's 25%, aluminum used to be 10, but now it's 25%. Let's make everything the same and make copper 25%. Now, that would be a huge deal. We don't have that in there, but it is something that's been worth watching out after. And the markets, again, the premium was actually a bit over 10%. Part of that was because we believe that there are speculators, even if it's not the base assumption, speculators are saying it could be 25%. And the other thing about copper is the U.S. has more capacity for making steel and aluminum than right now the U.S. does for copper. So a higher percentage of copper is imported than for steel and aluminum. And even though it is the lowest of the three metals in volume, it would have a very sharp impact.
Let's talk about that impact because copper is used in so many things. It's the metal of electrification. It's just everywhere. What industries might feel those effects, and what might that look like?
In no particular order, but I'm going to start with one that I do know would be the first one that would really construction. You can't put up a building without wiring. It's in everything. It's in factories. It's in houses. It's in commercial buildings. It is in power wires for long distance transmission. So construction would be directly hit by this, and it would be wiring and everything along that line. Second, electrical machinery, the things again, and there's a lot of electrification going on, expansions of grids and everything. Transformers. You can't expand the power grid without transformers. You can't build data centers. You can't do all of these things that we're doing. And by the way, the U.S. has no capacity to make the grade of copper that is needed in transformers. Again, we don't make any of it here, so it would all be facing the tariff, but there's no capacity to make it here. Along the same line, the other side of electrification, motors and generators. And if you think about it, everything just about that's indoors has an electric motor. Machine tools in a factory, forklifts in a warehouse, your washing machine, your dryer. Electric motors, again, use a lot of copper, and they would be hit directly. And so it would be really those types of things, electrical machinery, motors and generators, and construction for wiring would all be facing these tariffs. And for some of it, for right now, for transformer makers must import the copper. They can't get it domestically, no matter what price they're willing to pay.
That is a long list of things right there. So, Chris, how do you think the tariffs and the reviews that we've just been talking about, how will that alter the dynamics of global supply chains, especially for countries that are major suppliers to the U.S., like Canada, like Mexico?
Yeah, the devil's always in the details with these things. I think the first point to note is that if everybody has a tariff, then nobody has a tariff. All you've done is raise costs overall. So, if it is a 25% tariff on all copper from everywhere or all pharmaceuticals from everywhere, then it really just comes down to a debate as to whether you go to the US or not, or whether you have some strategy to mitigate the tariffs within the US. And there's a whole bunch of different areas there. Where it gets raunchy is if there's a decision to apply tariffs on specific products from specific countries. Now, as we've discussed already, the 232s that have been completed don't differentiate by country. There isn't necessarily an attempt to get people to move to a specific area. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the 232s provided a carve-out or exemption for Mexico and Canada. So to kind of leverage that area to recognize the kind of importance for some industries, you just need lower labor costs. And so that's going to lead you to Mexico. For some industries, you may need lower energy costs. So that's going to lead you to Canadian hydroelectricity or whatever the sub-dimensions are in there. So I think the using tariffs as a blunt instrument ironically means that they may actually have less effect. If companies say, actually, a 10% tariff or a 25% tariff, that's not enough to make us move to the United States. Because at the end of the day, tariffs is just one part of the overall reshoring decision. And companies still have to deal with all of those other operational risks, policy risks, labor cost risks, labor strike risks. I mean, a year ago, we were obsessing over the risk of port strikes, and that's kind of gone to one side. So, I would say, the broad brush tariffs, ironically, may end up having less of an impact on how supply chains are actually constructed. It's where there's exemptions and gaps that we start to see that effect start to come through.
And the goal is to move all of this back to the U.S., but even if you do, you can't build a factory overnight. You can't do these things immediately, even if you get the exact result you want. You can't get it immediately. And so, as Chris said, therefore, if you don't distinguish between countries until it reopens in the U.S., it has just spread out effect.
And I think on that investment side, what, as John said, one way to deal with the tariffs is to invest in the US. There's lots of other ways, but investing in the US takes time. And it's notable for electronics and pharmaceuticals, where this review is going on. Many, many companies have outlined tens of billions of dollars of investment, hundreds of billions in the case of the electronics sector. But they're all 5-year plans. They include not just investment, capital expenditure, it includes other forms of spending, but they're generally also back-end loaded. So these aren't necessarily dollars in the ground in 2025 or 2026. It's dollars in the ground in 2028 or 2029. And there's a lot of tariff change between here and there that could lead those investment decisions to shift.
Yeah, that's a lot of time for things to happen for sure. So question for both of you, what strategies should companies adopt to mitigate these risks to their supply chains and to their bottom lines? What strategies have you seen deployed already to address these issues?
So far, I have seen the key word, I would say, my core audience are purchasers, people who work for large companies and have to go out and go to the CFO and say, I'm going to need $100 million for steel next year. Now they're going and saying, I'm going to need $115 to $125 million for steel next year. And many of them are paralyzed. Some of them don't know what's going to be the number because it's gone up, it's gone down, and it's leading to, for construction, very much, and to manufacturing to a large extent, right now they're somewhat paralyzed and they're hedging their bets and they're looking for clarity. Until then, I'd say their strategy has seemed to be, let's wait until we know more. My advice has been, literally look at alternate budgets. What happens if it stays at 25%? What happens if it's at 25%, but there is an exemption for Canada and or Mexico and or Japan or the European Union? So look at alternate scenarios, run them through, and look at different budget scenarios, but you really have to plan. You have to plan on the 25% number for steel. And again, I don't think steel prices will be... If the U.S. imported 100% of its steel and the tariff rate was 25%, then prices should go up 25%. The U.S. only imports about 20 to 25% of its steel depending on the year. So you're not seeing a full It's a 10% increase, not a 25% increase. But you have to look at it in your budget and look at the alternatives. Unfortunately, everything I just said was somewhat wishy-washy because we don't know the answer. And if you don't know the answer, it's hard to make a definitive plan. But the best we can do is say, plan your alternative scenarios and see if your project still makes sense under the high scenario, because you cannot assume relief will necessarily be coming. You cannot assume the rates will be lower. We believe that's a dangerous tactic. You have to make sure it makes sense at the higher rate and then plan for the highest and hope for the lowest. Of course, that's a value judgment. If you're a U.S. steelmaker, that's exactly what you don't want to hear. But if you're a U.S. steel buyer, that's the way we've been recommending that people plan for it.
I think when we look more broadly as well, so I think clearly it's the tactical and the strategic. The strategic decision, where do we source from? We've seen companies talk a lot about splitting the tactical from the strategic. On the strategic side, you've got this principle where companies are reorganizing their supply chain in the short term. So call it kind of global regionalization, shipping your China stuff not to the US, but ship it to Europe instead and use India to supply the US. The reshoring decision takes many years. Those are strategic decisions, really. Tactically, it all comes down to price and burden sharing. We've actually seen companies overall have become more positive when they talk about tariffs. They haven't become positive, they've become less negative, let's put it in those terms. And a lot of that is because they feel they've been able to reach agreements with their suppliers about how they're going to share the burden and looking increasingly at passing through those costs to consumers. Now, it has to be done very carefully. It has to be done arguably very privately. There's no sense antagonizing the US administration by announcing big price increases and we're dealing with tariffs that way. One thing we have been seeing, though, and this is outside the metals sector, this has actually been across consumer goods sectors, are discussions around separating tariffs as a line item within the procurement discussion. So, we're going to have an escalator year over year. It's going to include labor costs and steel costs and whatever. And then we'll include tariffs separately. So you can imagine having a separate tariff line that says, okay, if it's 25%, you'll cut your price by this. If it's 10%, this. So having those scenarios kind of pre-coded. Of course, absolutely, as John says, we don't know where we're going to end up. So taking the tariff part out of the calculation and having it separate may be one of the key ways to deal with tariffs.
Well, we could go on, but we've already covered a lot of ground today, so I think it's time to wrap up our discussion for this episode. What would be your top takeaways for our listeners today? John, let's start with you.
July 9, I believe, and I'm maybe stepping on Chris's thing because I look narrow, he looks broad, but July 9 is the big date coming up. That's when that big plaque that the president held up with all the different tariff rates, which has been suspended, but it's only been suspended until that date. So I would keep a close watch over June as what's going to happen there. And I would also say the big thing also is, again, it's steel and aluminum, but now it's fabrications. So things that were never covered before now are covered. And I would strongly suggest just looking at anything you import, whether you have to go the bill of lading or whatever, and look at the codes to find out, is my product covered or not? The devil is in the details. It's easy for steel. It's easy for aluminum. It is not easy for machinery. It is not easy for fabricated metals. If you're importing anything that is finished or semi-finished, spend the time to see if it's covered or not. The past is no guide to the future because these things are new, and watch very carefully. You don't want to get on the wrong side of it and not pay and be hit in the back end, but you can't assume either way.
I think from my side, kind of the main takeaway is the visible part of tariffs are these big, splashy country-to-country negotiations. But actually, the bigger impacts for specific supply chains are going to come from these Section 232 reviews. They could hit at any time from May 27 through to December of this year. And whilst that can be quite daunting from a supply chain planning perspective, trying to just remove tariffs as a separate line item in the negotiations can help just allow you to focus on the business as usual whilst the tariff noise kind of continues to be the background to supply chain decision making as we go through the rest of the year.
All right. So past is not prologue. The devil's in the details. Filter out the noise. Thank you both, Chris and John, so much for walking us through all of this. It's been interesting to see this other side of the tariff conversation, the less glamorous side, as you put it, Chris. And until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.